Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is officially July 1st. It's going to be a crazy month in the sport of college football. I can just feel it. But we're going to start today with a little bit of an easier show. We're going to start talking a little bit about Colorado. We're going to get into how some of the expectations they're putting on themselves is kind of setting up the Dion and company era of Colorado for failure, and we'll kind of break that down and see how they can kind of adjust their expectations and make it a very, very successful program moving forward. Then we'll get into Quinn Ewers' comments. He made some comments about the SEC upcoming schedule that did not make a lot of people in the SEC realm of things very happy, so I want to break that down for you all. Then we'll get into Heisman odds. I'll give you some underdogs that I like, some guys that I don't necessarily love too much, and then some dark horses as I see it. We'll get into some recruiting updates. Oregon went on an absolute tear this weekend that we have to get into. And then we have Monday questions, and we're going to do a little bit of an SEC edition, break down some of the different things you guys got to know for the SEC this upcoming year. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show. And the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and that's always good for the both of us. So if you would like to use that, definitely do. Again, that's gsmcpodcast.net. But let's jump in. Let's talk about Colorado, and let's talk about how, frankly, they'll be okay. This is going to be a good program if they give themselves time. I think one of the big things that we talk about with Colorado, when we're talking about Colorado a lot, frankly, because they are the topic of conversation in college football, and frankly, they will be, in as long as Dion is in black and gold, Colorado will be at the forefront of the conversation in college football. Now, how they're going to be at the forefront changes every single year, right? Everything's very, very fluctuating there, and it will be for pretty much as long as he's there. That's just the reality. And the question is, how long can they kind of sustain this type of approach and the way that they're talking? I think is probably the biggest part of this is Dion came into the season with a lot of hype, right? They're coming into the season with a lot of energy, a lot of juice, and they're trying to deliver on that. But Dion has promised a playoff berth. They have promised a Big 12 championship. Both of those things are going to be really tough for this team to do, just plain and simple, I'll be totally honest. With the current roster that they have compared to the other ones around the Big 12, it's going to be remarkably hard for them to pull this off. Not to say that they can't, but just to say the expectations are relatively high if you're putting them up there. But the reality is, if you set those expectations very high, people are going to, react accordingly, right? If you go 7-5 this year, which frankly would be a really good year for this Colorado team, where 2 years ago you're 1-11, you've overturned the roster just insane amounts over the first 2 years. Going 5-7, going 8-4 or 7-5, excuse me, or going 8-4 would be a huge win. Period. End of story. But we wouldn't treat it like that. And I'm not necessarily saying that we should treat it like a huge success, because frankly, the guy up top told us not to. He said that if they don't make a playoff, if they don't win a Big 12 title, it is not a good season. So we should probably react accordingly, right? We should probably, say the certain things that he kind of put on himself in some ways. He has kind of created this aura around Boulder, and a lot of it is really good for that program. A lot of it is going to create this world where they can do things that they couldn't do 3 or 4 years ago, and frankly, they're doing a lot of them incredibly, incredibly well. I mean, one of the big things that Colorado has fallen short on for quite some time, but especially over the last, decade or so, is talent acquisition. It's been incredibly tough for them to get the number of players that they need to compete at a high level, and that's something that they've been kind of fighting with for quite some time. And then Dion rolled into town, and that pretty much was fixed overnight. Obviously, they have a ton of things to figure out in terms of the roster, but in terms of just getting these guys on campus, it's pretty effortless for this guy. He doesn't really go on home visits. He doesn't really do some of the things that some of the other coaches do, and still brings in guys like Jordan Seaton. Obviously, Travis Hunter came with him from Jackson State, so that's a little bit different, but LeJontay Wester, BJ Green, all of these guys are really talented, and a couple of years ago would not have looked twice at Colorado. That's just the reality. Dion brings a certain energy to that school and a certain juice to that school that kids want to play for him. That's never going to change, and that will always be the case for as long as Deion's there, frankly. And one of the other things is obviously leaning too much on the portal. That's the other big worry, and frankly, it's a worry for me as well. I don't necessarily love the way they're going about business, and I think the right way is through high school recruiting and then patching holes in the portal. All that being said, I think there's kind of an interesting approach that's kind of being formed around Colorado, which is we are going to lean on the portal. That's going to be the aggressive way that we go about business over here. But we also are going to go after high school for a couple of positions. And the ones that I've noticed most readily, at least, that they're going after is O-line and quarterback. And frankly, if I was going to pick two positions that I want to fill out from the high school ranks, it'd be those two. And obviously, if you need to patch holes with some higher level offensive linemen later on in their careers, that's totally fine. But if you want to build a sustainable product with your offensive line year over year, you're probably going to want to recruit from high school and make sure that you have guys kind of rolling in and out. That's why Jordan Seaton's likely going to start there for 3 years, starting this year. And there's going to be guys that roll in over the next couple of years that will probably start for at least a couple of years before moving on to the NFL. So those two positions, having them kind of nailed down is huge for this program, because say they flip Julian Lewis, say they kind of add him to the class, and this offensive line gets a little bit better and a little more talented, and they're doing a great job of that on the recruiting trail right now. If all of that kind of comes into play, this could be a team that maybe isn't, incredible next year, but is building towards something maybe in 26 or in 27 that can be a really good product. And that's kind of the big thing here, where everyone wants to hold Colorado to this standard, which is frankly the standard that Deion is putting on them. And I fully understand being confident in your team. I also understand not putting the expectations too high. So it's going to be kind of a battle back and forth, frankly, with myself to kind of not hold them to those standards and not hold them to those expectations. But I'm trying to take a step back, and I'm trying to remove the Colorado from it all, and remove the Deion, and remove those comments about, we're going to win the Big 12, we're going to go to the playoff, Shedeur is going to be the number one quarterback taken, and him and Travis Hunter are going to go top 5 in next year's draft. I'm trying to take all of that away and just look at this from a pure football perspective. This is a program that's getting better pretty much across the board. Whether you want to talk about talent acquisition, whether you want to talk about the coaching staff, whether you want to talk about NIL and all of those things, infrastructure, all of that stuff is better than it was when Deion walked in. Now it's a little bit different. There's no two ways about that. Not everyone loves the approach. I don't necessarily love it too much either. But it doesn't change that the approach is, at least in short term, working. They're getting better team. They started with a 1-11 team that had a talent level that was nowhere near getting ready to compete. They went 4-8 last year, and it wasn't necessarily the year that they wanted, and they kind of got torn apart for it. But let's be totally honest, a 3-win improvement is huge. And if they did it again this year and went to 7-5, it would be huge again, but it wouldn't be dealt with that way. And frankly, it's Deion's doing. And it's not necessarily to say that he shouldn't be confident in his guys. It's not to say that he shouldn't make some of the comments that he's making. It's just to say, give your program a shot. Don't let everyone else kind of bog down your program and make it seem like it's doing worse than it is, because then the recruits are going to listen to that. And then transfer portal guys are going to listen to that, and then you have to deal with that as a head coach. So I think that's the biggest thing here, where you look at the reality around Colorado. It's the reality at like 95% of the places around the country. Whether you want to talk about Deion possibly leaving in the future, or what if the talent dries up, or what if they don't perform over the next couple of years, all of those are problems at every single university except for a couple when you talk about moving on, because some are destination jobs. Colorado's not one of those, and it likely will never be, unless, Deion just wants to hang out for the next 20 years. But the reality is, the problems that we kind of look at Colorado and poke holes in what they're doing, a lot of them are pretty hypothetical. Whether it's Deion possibly leaving or them possibly not improving the way that they say they're going to prove, all of that stuff hasn't happened yet, or is just something that happens all across the country, and every single program has to worry about it. So I don't necessarily think we should hold it against Colorado that they are doing the same thing. And it's not necessarily to say that we shouldn't, take Deion for his word. We shouldn't necessarily expect this team to win a Big 12 title and go to the playoff and all of that type of stuff. It's just to say we should talk a little bit we should talk with a little bit of nuance when we talk about this team. Let's just be totally honest. When they come into a 1-11 team, take it to 4-8, the talent level is so much better the second year. Year one, and then you go into year two, the talent level is even better, especially across the lines of scrimmage, and you have even bigger aspirations for this upcoming year. Everything's moving in the right direction down there. You would think that this season is do or die for them. The way that everyone's talking about it, the way that Deion's talking about this season, you would think that this is the most important season in Colorado history. It's another building block. It's part of a process that they are building out over there. And frankly, I think they're going to be successful if they give themselves time to figure out what that model is. Because frankly, I don't think they're at their end result when it comes to how they build their roster and talent acquisition. I think they're going to go more towards the high school route in the next couple of years, if I'm being totally honest. I also think there's not necessarily going to be this, I suppose, aggressive energy to see Deion fail in the future, because there's going to be more results behind him to say, he can, do this, this, and this, and he has done this, this, and this, and we have to, react accordingly. So it's one of those things that I'm kind of stuck in between a rock and a hard place. I very much want to believe in what Deion's doing and love the approach, and I think a lot of the things are getting better over there. Frankly, almost across the board, they're getting better. But it doesn't change that expectations have been put on this team by the head guy that are a little unrealistic for this year. Let's just be totally honest. This team is not a playoff caliber team. If you look at that roster, you can kind of talk yourself into it, but it's really tough to do it. Because if you look beyond the starting 22, it's not necessarily the greatest team. And that's just the reality of what they're dealing with right now. It doesn't mean they can't be successful, and it doesn't mean Deion's not doing a lot of really good things down there. It's just to say there are a lot of coaches in this industry that have had really good success, but it hasn't been looked that way because they're at a certain program or because they talk a certain way to the media, and then their time is not remembered the way that it should be. So I fully understand that Colorado is moving in the right direction. I fully understand that there's going to be a lot of eyes on them going in the next couple of years, and I also fully understand that a lot of these worries that I have about this team were put there by their head coach Deion Sanders, but it doesn't change the reality, which is this Colorado team is getting better, and if they give themselves time to figure out what they want to do in the future and not necessarily add all of these expectations that are unrealistic to themselves, they're going to be a successful program. It's just going to take time, and frankly, right now, I don't think they're giving themselves enough time. So it's one of those things that I'm going to have to battle with this year. It's one of those things that a lot of us are going to have to battle with, where you want to treat Colorado the way that Deion, claims that they should be treated, as a playoff contender, but if you look at the roster, they're just frankly not. So it'll be fascinating to kind of watch that develop and see how people react to Colorado if they do make the playoff hypothetically, or if they do go 7-5 and 8-4. What is the conversation? Because it would be a win of a season, but I don't think it would be treated that way. But we're going to take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Quinn Ewers, and we're going to talk about the comments he made at the Manning Passing Academy and how some SEC fans are none too happy. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the news it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the show. We just talked about Deion Sanders and how this Colorado team is doing a lot of the right things, except for the expectations they're putting on themselves and kind of setting themselves for a little bit of failure this upcoming year. So we'll kind of see how everyone reacts as the season unfolds for Colorado. But let's get into Quinn Ewers and the comments that he made at the Manning Passing Academy. Texas and OU just joined the SEC today. Everything became official today. Texas had a little party on their campus yesterday to celebrate the move, and Quinn Ewers wasted no time. Frankly, he did this before, making every SEC fan very angry at him, and that's something that, frankly, I think is going to happen throughout the next year with Quinn Ewers. But the reality is, this all happened at the Manning Passing Academy, which had just ridiculous amounts of fantastic quarterbacks there, helping, coaching the younger players. Jackson Dart, Jalen Milroe, Connor Wegman, both Texas quarterbacks, Arch Manning, obviously, and Quinn Ewers were there, among others, Riley Leonard as well. So tons of big-time quarterbacks were at this camp, and they were teaching the kids. But Quinn Ewers was the one that made the headlines. He was the one that kind of got everyone talking. Let's just put it that way. And the comment that he made was, "We are everyone's biggest game. We know that." And one of the big things here is, I do want to be fair to Quinn Ewers before I start this. The reporter did say that while asking the question. He said, "You are everyone's biggest game. How does that kind of feel going into the SEC?" He was kind of just reiterating what the guy was saying. That doesn't mean he doesn't believe that. It's just to say that's kind of the approach that he was coming with. But let's get into the reaction from this, because there were tons of SEC fans that called him out saying Texas can't match up with SEC teams and they're going to get, humbled this upcoming year in the SEC. And there are a couple of things with that. First of all, 90% of the SEC, or let's say 80% just to be totally fair, should be nervous that Texas is on their schedule. Let's just be totally honest. Not to say that Texas isn't going to struggle with the weekly grind of an SEC schedule. I would argue they will, and I would argue it will add to more losses on the schedule than you see right now. But it doesn't change that if you wanted to match them up with every team across the SEC, you'd be fairly disappointed if you're an SEC fan to figure out what those results are. Let's just be totally honest. If you wanted to go top to bottom and match them up across the board, there's not a lot of teams they would lose to. Now, that's not to say they won't lose to a couple of teams this upcoming year. It's not to say that a team like Mississippi State or a team like Kentucky can't clip them at some point this year. It's just to say, when you look at this team compared to a, Tennessee or a Missouri or Ole Miss, those are going to be really good matchups. But if you compare them to Mississippi State or Florida or Vandy, Texas is just the better team. There's really no argument about it. Now, Florida is a little bit closer because of the talent level, but Texas is a better team than a lot of these teams. Also, on top of this is the right mentality to have. I fully understand that this is something that is going to make people mad, and I wouldn't expect anything different from a lot of the SEC fan bases out there. But the reality is, if you're going to be a high-level quarterback in this game, if you're going to be a player that leads your team to a national title the way that Quinn Ewers wants to do for this team this upcoming season, you have to think that everyone's coming in there trying to take your head off. You have to think that everyone's coming in there trying to get at you and trying to play this game as their biggest game on the schedule. Whether it's true or not, which frankly, I don't think this is true. It's not true. But the reality is, if he's not thinking this way, I think you have a bigger problem than if he is. I'll just be totally honest. I think Carson Beck should think this way. I think Jackson Dart should think this way. Jalen Milroe should think this way, because it adds that extra intensity. It adds the days that you don't want to get up and you don't want to go to work. You do it because you know that everyone in your conference that you're going into is trying to take your head off. And to be totally honest, based on the reaction to this, there's a lot of people that really want to do that this upcoming year. Let's just be totally honest about it. And also, let's not act like there are a ton of people not circling this game. There are so many teams across the country that are circling this game. Now, is the biggest game on their schedule? No, not for, a couple of these teams. But also, I could make the argument that probably half of the schedule that Texas plays, Texas is the biggest game. Texas is the game that they're circling the most and that they very much want to win the most. And some of it is because of this comment. Some of it is because of the arrogance around Texas that does exist to a certain degree. I'm not necessarily acting like it doesn't. I'm just saying it does have to exist to a certain degree. If Texas wants to be who they can be and who they're capable of being, they got to be a little arrogant. You got to be a little full of yourself. You got to be a little confident going into these years. And yeah, it's going to come off as cockiness at times. It's going to come off as annoying at times. And not everyone's going to love the comments that Quinn Ewers makes. But the reality is, if he's not wired this way, Texas isn't as successful as they can be. That's just the plain truth. And overall, the SEC is a new ballgame. There's no two ways about that, and everyone understands that, including Texas. I think a lot of people think that these comments mean that Texas doesn't get it, and that Quinn Ewers doesn't understand that he's taking a big step up. I think this means he does understand it. I think it means that he does understand what he's up against, and he's trying to hype his team up and hype himself up, and also get a little eyes on the games that they're going to be playing, because he has a lot of confidence in this team to go through a schedule that is going to be very difficult and more difficult than they have dealt with in the past. And he thinks that they're going to roll, if I'm being totally honest. And he should have that idea, because if you don't, again, you're not going to be as successful as you can be. So this is kind of a battle back and forth. Obviously, Texas and OU coming in, it's going to be different, and it's going to be a game that they're going to have to get used to. And frankly, we don't know how they're going to react to the physicality and the intensity week over week in the SEC until they get there. We have no idea how these teams are going to react. But if you want to just take it from face value and look at just their rosters, plain and simple, there's not a lot of SEC teams that they take a backseat to. There's a couple, don't get me wrong. I think Georgia is one of them for Texas. I think OU has a couple more in front of them, although I don't think the gap is quite as big as people want to make it out to be with Texas and OU as they walk into the SEC, but that's beside the point. I just think overall, there are a lot of SEC fans, beating their chest, saying the SEC is the big bad West and no one can handle what happens over here. In Texas and OU, and they walk in, they're going to be, humbled, and they're going to be beaten down by the physicality. And I'm not saying it's not going to be tougher for these teams. It's objectively going to be tougher for these teams. I'm just saying you might be barking up the wrong tree. You might be going after the wrong teams when you talk about that, because not only are these teams at a great place right now, but they recruit at an elite level. They do all of the things off the field in an elite level that you need to, and they're going to walk into this league with a lot of confidence and two coaches that they feel really confident in, Steve Sarkisian at Texas and Brent Venables over to Oklahoma. Everything is working at those two programs right now, and they're going to walk in with a ton of confidence, and this type of confidence that is going to make some people mad. And frankly, it should. Let's just be totally honest. This is energy that, Texas should have, but also people should be angry about, because all of this, on top of all of this, I'm not saying that Quinn Ewers is right. Frankly, I think he's wrong. I think when you look at across the schedule, UGA's biggest game is Bama to me. I don't think there's any question about that. Michigan's biggest game every single year for the end of time is going to be Ohio State. But it doesn't mean that there's not a lot of teams that are circling that game maybe first or second biggest on their schedule. So because of the expectations they're coming in, but also because they're wearing that jersey, because everyone wants to put Texas in their place as they walk into the SEC, and they should. This energy should be going both directions, whether you're Texas or you're a team in the SEC. You should want to get after the other. That's just the reality of football, and Quinn Ewers having this mentality going into this season is good for Texas. It's just the reality. It's a good thing that your quarterback is walking into this season saying, everyone's coming after me, everyone's coming after us, and I have to respond. That's the goal that you want to have for all of your players. And when your quarterback is leading the way, that's good news. So yes, this is a little bit arrogant. Yes, this is a little bit cocky. And yes, this is a little bit annoying. It doesn't change that this is the energy that Quinn Ewers should have every single time that he walks on that field. And it doesn't change that I think every single big quarterback should have this mentality every single time they walk on the field. And also, on top of all of this, Texas is a really good team. There are a lot of teams that are looking at this game wanting to beat them because they're number 3 in national title odds, because they're number 2 in odds to win the SEC, because they have the highest win total of anyone in the Power 4. That stuff matters, and everyone wants to beat that team. So this is not necessarily a crazy statement. It's not true. They're not everyone's biggest game, but they're a lot of people's biggest game. Let's be totally honest. And even if they're not, they're a really good team. And if you don't believe me, if you think they're going to beat up, if you want to go look up what Kirby Smart or Kalen DeBoer or Lane Kiffin has said about this Texas team, you're more than welcome to, because they know plenty about football, and they're seeing what everyone else is seeing, which is a really, really good program that is walking in with a really good quarterback. So overall, this is not a true statement. UGA is looking at Bama more than they're looking at Texas right now. I can almost promise you that. Michigan is looking more at Ohio State than they're looking at Texas right now. I would argue that if you wanted to pick a second game on those two schedules, it might be Texas, especially for UGA. I think Michigan's a little bit different because it's an out-of-conference, but regardless, Texas is a huge game on everyone's schedule. And Quinn Ewers saying this comment obviously is going to make some people mad and is going to get some people riled up, but it's also the mentality that he should have. It's also the way that he should be acting. And it's a little bit arrogant, but that's the reality of college football. You have to be a little bit arrogant. You have to have that unadulterated confidence if you're going to play at an elite level, if you're going to play at the level that Quinn Ewers needs to play at for this team to do what they want to do this year. So overall, the comments are not true. Let's just be totally honest. Texas is not the biggest game on everyone's schedule that they play. It doesn't change that they're a huge game on everyone's schedule. They're not the biggest, but they are absolutely huge. And even if they were the smallest, I would have an issue if my starting quarterback wasn't coming out saying, every single game I need to show up absolutely ready, because they're coming in ready. And they're coming in as if this is the biggest game in the world and they have to win it. They're Super Bowl, as people say. So I understand why the comments made everyone upset. I understand why everyone in the SEC says that Texas and OU are going to be put in their place. I just think everyone should be a little bit more careful when they talk about Texas and OU, because they're not necessarily coming in limping by any means. So it'll be fascinating to watch that unfold, and if Quinn Ewers has to eat those words a little bit, or if he gets to throw them all in everyone's face at the end of the year. But we're going to take our second break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the Heisman. There are tons of things happening. Last week we did a Heisman watch, kind of breaking down the top 5 across every conference. Now we're just going to go into the odds, and we're going to break down some people I like, some I don't like, and a couple of dark horses as I see it. So stick with us, and we'll break that down right after this.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about Quinn Ewers' comments where he said we are everyone's biggest game on the schedule, and how that's not necessarily the case, but also the way that Quinn Ewers should absolutely be feeling going into the season for Texas. So definitely really interesting comments, and we'll see how that kind of unfolds throughout the season. But let's jump into Heisman odds, and there are so many things to break down. Obviously, last week we went into the Heisman watch, kind of broke down 5 players that you should watch going into this season for the Heisman. Now I want to look at the odds, and we'll break down kind of, first of all, how kind of broken these odds are and how broken this kind of trophy is at this point. But regardless, we'll break down all of the different odds that you need to be looking at, some that I like, some that I don't necessarily like too much, and then a couple of dark horses that I think are really interesting. But let's jump right in here and let's talk about this, because there's so much to break down. But let's start with the top 10, and it starts with Carson Beck. I think that makes total sense. That is the best quarterback in the country on the best team in the country, if you were to ask me. So that's no question. I think he absolutely is number one. Quinn Ewers not too far behind him, with Dylan Gabriel right there as well. So those are the top 3 quarterbacks in the country by my estimation, and they play for 3 of the top 4 teams in the country. So not too crazy. And then you add Will Howard in there. That's just kind of the reality of this trophy at this point. It goes to one of the quarterbacks of one of the best teams in the country pretty much every single year, and that's just kind of the reality. So the top 4 guys being from the top 4 teams in the country as we go into this year is not necessarily all that surprising. That being said, it doesn't necessarily, it gets a little bit crazy as we kind of get down this list a little bit more, and Nico Iamaleava being this high is very interesting to me. It's not necessarily to say he doesn't deserve to be this high, because his talent is just off the charts incredible, and we've seen what Tennessee and Josh Heupel can do with a really good quarterback, but it is impressive, and it gives you an idea of just how incredible some of the people think that this guy is going to be. And overall, I mean, you see the number of SEC guys here. 6 of the top 8 guys on this list, SEC quarterbacks. So it gives you an idea of just how many guys are in that conference and how many incredible matchups we're going to have. And frankly, I think that's probably where you're going to see this trophy come from, is some SEC quarterback this upcoming year, the same way you saw it last year with Jaden Daniels. But we'll see how that kind of unfolds. You also have Garrett Nussmeier right there at plus 1,800, so a lot of these guys are just going to be top SEC quarterbacks, so that's just kind of the way that we kind of are going to be tracking this, is who's at the top of the SEC, who is their quarterback. That guy's probably the top of the list for the Heisman. But there's some other guys here. Obviously, Riley Leonard, a very talented guy at plus 2,000, making his way over to Notre Dame. A ton of expectations on him. He was actually at the passing academy for the Mannings this past weekend and won the little trophy that they give out to one of the college players there. He absolutely put on a clinic throwing the ball, so very impressive performance from him. Cam Ward right there with a ton of expectations coming into this year with Miami at 2,200 or plus 2,200. Avery Johnson and Connor Wegman right behind him, and then Jackson Arnold and Jalen Daniels. So the top 10 is a little bit all over the place in some ways. You know, you have some players that are expected to just, light the world on fire this upcoming year in Carson Beck, Quinn Ewers, maybe Dylan Gabriel. Then you have some players that are just going to be on really good teams and might not necessarily put up the stats that are Heisman stats, quote unquote, like the Riley Leonards, like the Will Howards, like some of the other guys on this group. So overall, it's a very interesting group. You have Riley Leonard ahead of Cam Ward and Avery Johnson. I think some of that is just the reality of this trophy at this point. Notre Dame probably has better odds to win the national title than either of those two teams, and if you can do that, then you're probably going to have a shot to win the Heisman. So that's just kind of the reality. It's not necessarily crazy that Riley Leonard's above them, but if I was going purely based off who's the better player to me, I would have those two guys above him, but, it's splitting hairs at that point. Jackson Arnold and Jalen Daniels kind of breaking the top 10 here. It's pretty cool. Both these guys are very, very talented, and they're going to have to rely on their O-lines to make some really good plays, particularly Jackson Arnold, but both are just ridiculously talented and can do some just really incredible things this upcoming year. So really happy to see those guys that high, and frankly, I think one of them could, shock the world and make a Heisman-type run this upcoming year, particularly Jackson Arnold if that offensive line can hold up. But Jalen Daniels does not take a backseat to many people in his conference either. So it'll be fascinating to watch that. But let's get into some of the guys I like, some I don't like, some dark horses, and some overall takeaways. One of the big things that I want to, get into as I get into the guys that I like, Nico Iamaleava is very high on this list. There's no two ways about that. At plus 1,500 as a first-year starter, that's pretty wild. And it's definitely something that's going to be crazy. But I think it's also Vegas just not getting caught again. They're not going to get caught by Tennessee having a good quarterback and them not giving them good Heisman odds, because they've seen what can happen. If Hendon Hooker was healthy that upcoming year, he's likely in New York City, and he's maybe taking home that trophy. So the reality is, I think this is just, Vegas not wanting to get got. And frankly, I kind of agree with them. If Nico Iamaleava and Josh Heupel are on the same page, this kid can do just incredible things this upcoming year and can win a Heisman. I know that sounds a little bit crazy because this Tennessee team is a little bit unknown, and if you're college football 25, they might not exist in your mind. But regardless, this is going to be a really good team. And if Iamaleava can execute this offense at the level that Hendon Hooker did, he's going to be in that conversation. There's no two ways about that. This team is going to be good, and they're going to have the ability to do some of the things that they need to do for him to win this award. Another one I like is Avery Johnson. I think his ability is just off the charts. He can do everything that you want him to do with the football. That's a big reason why the starting quarterback over at Ohio State left, because of this kid. It wasn't by coincidence. It wasn't because Will Howard just really wanted to be at Ohio State. It was because Kansas State was starting Avery Johnson one way or the other. So Will Howard was going to have to find another home, or he's going to be sitting on the bench, because this kid is just so talented. So very much like what he can do. I think there's so many things that he can do this upcoming year, including running away with the Big 12 and being by far the best quarterback in that conference, and possibly taking home the Heisman. And then you have Brady Cook at plus 3,500, a little bit lower on the list, but I think he's one of those guys that absolutely is going to execute this offense at a really high level. And when you have the three guys around him that he has in Luther Burden, Mookie Cooper, and Theo Weiss, you're going to do some pretty incredible things. I think there's a reality that, maybe the numbers aren't insane enough for him to win a Heisman, but they definitely could be. This offense could be very, very potent, and I think Brady Cook is someone that can execute it at a ridiculously high level, to be totally honest. And then guys I don't necessarily like, Will Howard probably starting this list. I just don't think he's going to put up the crazy stats, and frankly, I don't think he needs to. I think that defense is going to be good enough. I think that running game is going to be ridiculous, so I don't necessarily think he has to be Superman. I don't think he has to be a Heisman-level guy for them to win a national title. So I don't necessarily love him being this high because I don't think they're going to set him up in that way. I don't think the offense is going to be built in that way. And that's the same reason I don't necessarily love Riley Leonard. I think they're both really good quarterbacks, and I think they're going to do really good things this upcoming year. But I also think they're just going to execute the offense. And that's just kind of the world that they live in for the time being. And that's not a bad thing by any means. Both these teams could win a national title with both these quarterbacks just executing the offense. But it is also to say they're not necessarily going to put up the gaudy Heisman numbers that we've seen in the past. So I think that's kind of the reality that they're living in. Jackson Arnold also on this list. This is kind of just, if it were all in Jackson Arnold's hands, I would have no issue with him being this high, if I'm being totally honest. But I do have concerns about the O-line, at least, being the O-line that it needs to be from the get-go. I think they'll develop into a very good group, but if he has a couple of, not so great games to start and he kind of gets off to a rough start, it might be over before it started for him as far as the Heisman goes. So don't necessarily love where he's standing just because it's not just on him, it's on the five guys in front of him, and I just don't necessarily love that situation right now. The dark horses, as I see it, are Jalen Daniels at plus 3,000 because this kid's ceiling is just ridiculously high. When he's on the field, he does just incredible things. Obviously, that's a relatively big if, and you got to figure out how to keep him on the field for an entire season, but if they can do that, this kid can do just anything he puts his mind to. Kansas can do a number of incredible things this upcoming year, including winning the Big 12 and going to a playoff and possibly sending a guy to New York City to win that Heisman Trophy. So it would be remarkable to see that happen. And then Luther Burden is another guy I'm watching, a little bit biased towards Missouri, and we'll talk about them a little bit later in the show, but Luther Burden is just different. I've said it a number of times. I think he's the best offensive player in the country. I don't think you'll find a guy that is better at his position on the offensive side of the ball than Luther Burden, and maybe you won't find anyone better at their position across the entirety of college football on both sides of the ball, but this kid is just different in every sense of the word. He can do everything you want him to do on the football field, and he's going to do incredible things. We've talked about him a number of times, but I think he's one of those few wide receivers that I've seen over the last 3-4 years that can do what Devontae Smith did in 2020, that can pull off a year that everyone, doesn't even look at the quarterback for that Heisman spot, which obviously Mac Jones did get some love, but it was about Devontae Smith. It was about how incredible he was and how ridiculous it was that he was as open as he was on some of these plays. So a lot of this is going to fall on Kirby Moore and putting Luther Burden in position to succeed, but it's not that hard to do. If I'm being totally honest, this kid is so easy to put in winning positions because he does that the second he steps on the field. He's in a winning position when he's lined up on a play. So this guy is just absolutely different, and I think it's going to be fascinating to watch this develop. Obviously, the Heisman overall is not necessarily the way that I love it. The top 22 guys, I think, on this list were quarterbacks. Julian Sayin, who as of right now is the third stringer over at Ohio State, was above Luther Burden, who in my opinion is the best offensive player in the country. So I do have some issues with the way that the Heisman works at this point in time. I do have some issues that it is just, are you the quarterback for a top team in the country? Congratulations, here's the Heisman. But it doesn't necessarily change that this is a very interesting race, and there's going to be a ton of things to watch, and there could be a dark horse from another position that possibly steals it from one of these guys, but frankly, right now it looks like a quarterback-driven award, and that's the way it's been for quite some time, but it's getting even more that direction this last little bit. So it'll be fascinating to kind of watch that race develop, but let's take our third break here. When we come back, let's talk about recruiting. There's so much stuff happening around recruiting, and Oregon had a crazy weekend this last weekend. I want to break down just how incredible they did and how some other teams definitely suffered because of it. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about Heisman odds, broke down some of the different things I'm watching, some dark horses to watch, some guys that I don't necessarily love their odds right now, but I do love some other guys, so broke down all of that for you guys. But let's jump into recruiting, and let's get into what a weekend that Oregon had. They absolutely controlled this weekend from start to finish, and in the process kind of put some other teams in the trash can. Let's put it that way. They absolutely dominated some other teams on the recruiting trail this weekend, and frankly, it started this weekend with Dorian Brew, one of the biggest pickups of the entire cycle for Oregon. I believe the number 2 guy in their class, if I'm not mistaken. A very, very talented kid. One of the top one of the top corners, in the entire country. A guy that can genuinely step into that Jabbar Muhammad void at the end of the season and probably play right away. Just a really, really talented kid. Was an Ohio State lean for a very long time. Took an Oregon visit, I believe, last week. I could be wrong about that. I think he took it this past weekend or the weekend before that, and they just turned his head, I suppose. They absolutely made a really good impression, and now Ohio State really has to focus on Trey McNutt that back end, because if they don't lock him in, that might be an issue, and he was in Eugene this past weekend. So there's got to be a little bit of worry over there in Columbus, because they just lost one of their biggest guys, and one of their other guys might be heading that direction towards Oregon this upcoming week. But the reality is Oregon's just doing incredible things on the recruiting trail, and it didn't stop there by any means. Jordan Davison is a very talented running back, number 5 in the country, 4-star running back, a very, very good player. Held offers from essentially every big school. When you think about running backs, I believe was mainly down to Michigan, Ohio State, and Oregon. Made his decision to go to Oregon. This one's a little bit less surprising than the other one, but the reality is a huge pickup, and Ohio State was definitely after this guy. Michigan was definitely after this guy, so a big-time pickup for the Ducks there. They also got the number 3 tight end in the country, Deshaun Bram, a very, very talented player. 3 of the top 4 guys in Oregon's class right now committed this past weekend. So just a remarkable weekend for Oregon, and this is an elite player at an elite size. He's going to do just incredible things for them, and the way they use tight ends is a thing of beauty over there in Will Stein's offense. So it'll be really awesome to watch all of that unfold. And then they got back over to the defensive side of the ball, adding Josiah Sharma, a very talented 4-star D lineman. He committed to the Ducks, and this was one that seemed like it was going to be Bama or Texas. In fact, when I previewed him on Friday, I believe, didn't even talk about Oregon because they weren't on the list. It was Washington, Alabama, and Texas because he was committed to DeBoer while he was at Washington, and Texas got a crystal ball the day before his decision, but Oregon came in and just stole the party. However they did that, there will obviously be people saying they just cut him a check, and that's the way that recruiting works now. If that is, then Oregon's winning the game. Let's just be totally honest. So absolutely huge weekend for Oregon, something that they absolutely, wanted to do in this upcoming class, and they're just doing incredible things and kind of blowing even my expectations, which were really high for this class, out of the water. So really, really impressive stuff over there from Dan Lanning. But let's get into the rest of the commitments, because there were tons across every team in the country. Trajan Odom, a very, very talented edge rusher out of North Carolina. He committed to Ohio State this weekend, so not everything was bad for the Buckeyes up in Columbus. This one is a little interesting because sometimes you'll find a player that is an outlier on one of these websites, on one of these recruiting websites, whether it's, he's rated way higher on one or way lower on one. This is one where On3 really likes this kid, and it's not that other sites don't like this kid, but he's not rated nearly as high as he is on On3, so we'll see if they're right. We'll see if this kind of recruiting site war that tends to happen around some of these players goes in On3's direction or everyone else's, but regardless, this is a very talented D lineman, and he's going to be a very good player for them. So very much like this pickup. And then you got Marion Dye, a very talented edge rusher. He committed to Tennessee, a very big pickup for Tennessee. They're kind of continuing to build out that defense and make it one of the best in the country. and make it something that Josh Heupel hasn't had there. So it'll be really remarkable to kind of see this develop. Obviously, James Pierce Jr. will be off to the NFL at the end of the year, so they're going to need edge rush help, and it might have to come from a freshman, so maybe Marion Dye is that guy. That was kind of interesting. Did not mean to rhyme there, if I'm being totally honest. Julius Hawley is another guy I want to talk about, a really good edge rusher out of Alpharetta High School in the Atlanta area. He went to Michigan, came off the board, a very talented player. Obviously, Michigan's going to do work on the defensive side of the ball. That's changing no time soon, and when they bring in a kid, you might want to watch him a little bit closer because they've been really, really good about evaluating talent up there the last little bit, and I don't think that's changing anytime soon. But let's move right along here. Malik Washington, the top uncommitted quarterback, at least last week, is no longer that way. He is committed to Miami, a very, very good quarterback, and frankly, I think he might just start right away when he shows up on campus in 2025. I think there is a lot of things happening around Maryland that aren't necessarily moving in the perfect direction for them in the future. You know, a lot of teams coming into that league that might be a little bit above them. A lot of the things just kind of going in the wrong direction for Maryland. But you insert a guy like this, a lot of that stuff can flip around very quickly. So a big-time pickup for this team, and I think he's one of those guys that we're going to be talking about in probably in a year's time, frankly, gearing up to start his first game for Maryland. So a very talented player, the top uncommitted quarterback. He came off the board, and now I believe there's only one big-time quarterback that is still on the board. So it'll be fascinating to watch what happens there. But Dijon Lee is another guy I want to talk about, another 5-star cornerback that came off the board with Dorian Brew this past week. He's making his way to Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and Kalen DeBoer just keeps cooking on the recruiting trail. A lot of people assume that wouldn't be the case. That was always going to be the case. It's Alabama, and they're going to be able to recruit well, and this is just another piece to a class that is just becoming one of the best in the entire country. So really remarkable work from that staff down there. This is one of the biggest pickups they had, and it doesn't feel like they're slowing down anytime soon. Micah Strickland is another very talented cornerback that I want to talk about. He committed to TCU, 4-star cornerback, and definitely something that TCU needed as they move into this kind of new era with a lot of teams that they're going to have to battle for some recruiting things that are not going to be ideal. You got to battle a couple of in-state schools now that are in the SEC in Texas and Texas A&M. Not ideal on the recruiting trail, but they're doing just fine over there in Fort Worth. Then we'll get to Florida State. Myron Charles did a great job, a very, very fantastic player on the D-line. Another D-lineman that Texas was after, but Florida State got him. A big-time pickup for the Seminoles. This D-line recruiting class for Texas is not necessarily shaping up the way that the Longhorns would want, and frankly, Bo Davis leaving was absolutely huge for that team. So we'll see how that develops. Obviously, plenty of time in this recruiting cycle, but as of right now, the Texas D-line recruiting is not necessarily where you want it to be if you were a Texas fan. Florida State, though, also got Chase Lofton, a very, very talented tight end, number 2 player in the state of Nebraska, a very, very good player, a long body in that offense, and elite tight end play is no stranger to Florida State fans, so that definitely will continue. A very, very talented player. Another guy I want to touch on is Zay Thomas. Don't have a picture for him here, but he committed last night. He is the first member of the Seminole tribe to commit to Florida State to play football, so a very, very cool moment for him, a very cool moment for Florida State and his family, so very, very awesome all around there. Definitely will be fascinating to watch him play for this team, but I want to get into Penn State and talk about Jeff Enixor, a very, very good 4-star wide receiver. He's now on that Penn State commit list, and that's absolutely huge for them. They need to start bringing in more of these guys, more of these elite-level wide receivers, and I think Andy Kotelnicki and his offense will help with that a ton. So a very talented guy and definitely someone that will probably be playing early on during his time at Penn State because of the need they have at wide receiver. And then finally, a decommitment that happened this weekend. Akeelan Deere, a very, very talented running back, one of the best running backs in the country, decommitted from Ole Miss this weekend. And the kind of continues a little bit of a skid that Ole Miss has had on the recruiting trail. Definitely will be something to watch, but it looks like Bama might be the winner here. To be totally honest, everything has shifted in that direction, and I would not be surprised if Bama got a commitment here pretty soon from this kid. So Kalen DeBoer just continues to do work. The second he showed up in Tuscaloosa, there were questions about recruiting. He has subsided all of those worries for Alabama fans and have created a lot of worries for a ton of other SEC fan bases. But let's get into Oregon here for a second, because I knew Oregon was going to be a player. I knew they were going to be a problem on the recruiting trail, the Nike ties and being up in Eugene and everything that is going right for that program. I knew that they were going to be a player. I didn't know they were going to be able to stuff big-time teams in the locker and over one weekend, whether it was Texas or Ohio State or Alabama. They took some teams to the woodshed this weekend and did some really, really incredible things. And we can have a conversation about the way that they're going about recruiting. We can have a conversation about the way that they're leveraging NIL. The game is the game, and they're winning a lot of these battles that they're going to have to win to be a elite team. So absolutely huge weekend for them. Definitely will be a fascinating thing to watch. And usually the teams that dominate the summer months are the teams that end up at the very top of the list at the end of the year. So far, Oregon, Bama, Georgia, Ohio State have all dominated these couple of weeks and probably will continue to dominate, and you will find them towards the top. So it'll be fascinating to see what Oregon can do. They want to pick up a commitment from DeCorian Moore here pretty soon. Texas does have a lead there, but as we just saw with Josiah Sharma, that doesn't necessarily mean too much to Oregon. So it'll be fascinating to watch this develop. I definitely think it'll be a pretty crazy couple of weeks here. I think there's going to be a ton of big-time guys that come off the board. 6 of the top 10 and 9 of the top 15 recruits in the country are uncommitted right now. So there's going to be a lot of stuff that happens, whether it's, David Sanders committing and being the top offensive tackle off the board, or some of the quarterbacks maybe flipping. I know Julian Lewis is, it feels like he's hanging on by a thread on that USC class. So it'll be fascinating to watch this develop, but it feels like over the next couple of weeks, the top 5 will really start to take shape, and we'll figure out who had a fantastic year in recruiting and who didn't necessarily have the year that they were expecting. It will be fascinating to watch that unfold, but let's take our last break here. And when we come back, we're going to talk about Monday questions. We're going to get into a kind of an SEC edition. We're going to break down some different things, break down what is the biggest game in the SEC schedule, as Quinn Ewers alluded to a little bit earlier. We'll talk about some of the highly touted quarterbacks and who might just disappoint this upcoming year. And then we're going to talk about Missouri and why, frankly, we haven't been talking about them a little bit more. So we'll break down all of that right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just did a little bit of a recruiting update for you guys, broke down the ridiculous weekend that Oregon had and some of the other commitments. There was a big weekend for Florida State. A couple other teams got some big time commitments, so I wanted to break that down for you guys as we get into what is going to be a very, very big time in recruiting. But let's get into some Monday questions. We're going to break down the SEC a little bit. We have a couple of questions that I want to kind of get into. We got into Alabama last week, but we're going to broaden the scope just a little bit, get into the full scope of the SEC and kind of break it down. And I think the biggest thing here that I want to break down that we talked about a little bit earlier when we talked about Quinn Ewers' comments is, what is the biggest game on the SEC schedule? What is the one that we should all be pointing to as the number one biggest game? And obviously, everyone's going to point to Texas and UGA as towards the top of the list. These are the two teams with the highest odds and the highest win totals in the SEC. They're facing off at Texas in, I believe, October 19th, I believe is the date. And that is obviously going to be a huge game. There's no two ways about that. That is going to be the main event pretty much no matter which weekend you put it on. That's going to be the one that everyone's circling. That doesn't necessarily mean it's the biggest one in the conference, though, because UGA does travel to Bama. They do travel to Ole Miss. Also, you have Bama LSU. You have LSU Ole Miss, a very, very talented two teams that absolutely will have a ton to say about this conference this upcoming year. But there's one game in particular that I think everyone should be looking at, that I think everyone should be circling as the quote-unquote biggest game in the SEC schedule, and it's Bama against Georgia. There's no two ways about this, and I think there's a lot of things at play here. Obviously, these are two of the top 5 teams in the country. If you were to ask me, these are two of the teams that absolutely can win a national title and can do just incredible things in the SEC this upcoming year, regardless of what people want to tell you about Bama and how, they're done after, Saban hangs them up. They're not. I can almost promise you that. This is going to be an incredible game, and frankly, this is one of the more interesting games, not because of what's going to happen on the field, which is going to be incredible in its own right, but because of the dynamics off the field. Obviously, Nick Saban just walked out of the building, and let's just be totally honest, he controlled Georgia the entire time he was at Bama. There was very few times that Georgia got one over on him. Obviously, that national title in 21 is a very sweet one to get over on him, but for the most part, Saban just kind of controlled them the entire time, and now he's gone. Now the big bad bully is gone, and Georgia can kind of assert their dominance over this conference. The question is, the reality is, they got to walk into Tuscaloosa and take it this upcoming year. Bama's not going to give it to them, and if they don't go in there and win that game and, assert their dominance over them and the rest of the conference, there's going to be some conversations to be had. Kirby Smart can, sit atop the mountaintop and kick down Kalen DeBoer just a little bit as he's getting into the conference, or Kalen DeBoer can make everyone look really, really dumb and show everyone that they're still going to be Bama, and they're still going to dominate everyone. They're still going to do a lot of the things that Bama did when Saban was there. So it's going to be fascinating to watch, but the reality is I'm circling that September 28th meeting in Tuscaloosa more than any other game on the SEC schedule, because it's going to be an incredible game, but also it's going to dictate the way that we look at the SEC going forward for quite some time. Whether it's Georgia going in and winning by 14 and being the team that everyone's scared of going forward and maybe being the new Alabama, or Alabama asserting their dominance once again over Georgia and keeping that spot at the top of the mountaintop, because as of right now, they are the returning champion in that conference, and they are the one that everyone is trying to knock off, at least right now. Obviously, that could all change very, very quickly for Georgia, but the reality is this game is going to be as big as any other game on the schedule. But the other thing I want to get into is there's a lot of highly touted quarterbacks coming into this year. There's a lot of guys that we're watching as we come into this year for the SEC. Which one kind of disappoints? Because let's be honest, there's not enough seats at the table. There's a ton of really talented guys in this conference, and there's not going to be enough wins to go around for everyone to have a great season. Whether, you'd love to see Nico Iamaleava or Jackson Arnold or Connor Wegman have great seasons, the reality is one of those 3 guys is likely going to stumble a little bit. And frankly, I'd lean mostly towards Jackson Arnold. It's not necessarily an indictment on him, because frankly, I think he holds water with both of those guys, Iamaleava and Wegman, when you look at the pure talent perspective, but he's got to rely on the 5 guys in front of him, and I just don't think it'll be as strong as the other 2 will get. So it's just kind of the reality of, if it was all on Jackson Arnold, I'd be more than happy to say he's going to have an incredible season and do awesome things, and frankly, I think he's going to have a really good season, but I do think that O-line is going to get in the way of his overall ceiling in some ways, and definitely will not necessarily have the season that he's capable of having and likely will have in 2025 and 2026 hypothetically, once the offensive line is ironed out just a little bit more. But guys like Nico Iamaleava, guys like Connor Wegman are definitely ones to watch here, because the reality is, although these are really highly touted guys, and Wegman we've seen a little bit more of, we've seen some flashes that are just incredible, but we don't really know what they're going to look like throughout an entire season. We don't really know how much we're going to get from these guys, because we haven't really seen too much from these guys. So it'll be fascinating to kind of watch that develop. But overall, I think their situations are just a little bit more solid than Jackson Arnold's is. But also, there's other guys on this list. There's obviously, Brock Vandegrift is someone that everyone is watching this upcoming year. A 5-star guy coming out of high school, definitely has a lot of aspirations for this upcoming year. Blake Shapen, another guy coming in to Mississippi State. Diego Pavia coming in to Vandy. So there's going to be a lot of guys to watch. Also have some veteran guys like Jalen Milroe, Brady Cook, Jackson Dart, some very talented veteran guys that frankly, some of them are going to have frustrating seasons. There's just not enough wins to go around. There's not enough good play to go around, and there's too many good defenses on the other side of the field in the SEC for all of these guys to light it up. So whether it's Connor Wegman or Jackson Arnold or Nico Iamaleava or Brock Vandegrift or Jalen Milroe or Brady Cook, whoever it's going to be, a couple of these guys are not necessarily going to perform the way they want. Maybe it's Quinn Ewers, maybe it's Carson Beck, but someone in the SEC at the quarterback position is going to leave very frustrated with this year, and it'll be interesting to see what happens because there's a lot of unknown situations and new starters in the world, and some are going to fall on their face. I'll just be totally honest. But the final question I want to get into is, why are we not talking about Missouri more? I fully understand that when you talk about the SEC, you're going to start with UGA, you're going to start with Texas, you're going to start with Ole Miss and Bama. Missouri's not that far behind some of these teams. And I understand that they're not, the coolest team in the world. Eli Drinkwitz is not necessarily the swaggiest guy you've ever seen in your life. But the reality is this is a really good program. They've been doing just incredible things throughout their time. Brady Cook controls this offense like none other. It's just incredible to watch him execute. And obviously Luther Burden, Theo Weiss, Mookie Cooper, remarkable, just incredible wide receiver group, one of the best in the entire country. I did have a little bit of worry about their offensive line going into this offseason. They went out and got Marcus Bryant and Caden Green and made me feel a ton better about what their offensive line is going to look like. Those will be the two guys on that left side for them, and they're just going to do an incredible job. Two really, really good players that absolutely will play a huge part. And then they added Marcus Carroll, a very, very talented guy from Georgia State. I think he's going to pick up right where Cody Schrader left off last season. I think he's honestly one of those guys that we probably should be talking about a little bit more. A very, very talented running back that, although he was at Georgia State last year, is more than ready to play an SEC schedule and absolutely will be a huge player for them. And I think him and Nate Noel are just going to be really, really talented coming from that Group of 5 level up to the SEC and showing that they can hold their weight, no doubt about that. And then you had the back end guys that are going to be huge. Drayden Norwood, probably the main among them, but Toriano Pride Jr. is going to be absolutely huge for this team, but both those guys are really, really good players, and they're coming in for huge players in Chris Abrams-Drame and Enos Rakestraw from a year ago, but both those guys are plenty talented and can definitely fill those voids when needed. So very talented, a very good group, I think, across the board, whether you look at offense or defense. I think the offense is a little bit more inclined than the defense is, but it's not necessarily a far reach for the defense to be really good this upcoming year. I think they've just done an incredible job. Eli Drinkwitz, from the second he showed up in Columbia, Missouri, was ready to go to work and did a lot of the right things with this Missouri team, particularly on the NIL front. They're just doing incredible stuff in that world, but it's going to be awesome to watch this team develop. I don't think the run game will be any worse. I think the wide receiver core is one of the best in the entire country. A third-year starting quarterback is a luxury that not many teams in the country have this upcoming year. So, and when you look at the teams that do have it, they're the top teams in the country, whether it's Jackson Dart at Ole Miss, whether it's Quinn Ewers at Texas. Those are the teams that you're looking at in this conference, and Brady Cook is right there with them as third-year starter. So it's going to be fascinating to watch this team develop, but I think Missouri's a team that might just sneak up on you because their schedule, if you look at it, is very manageable for a team that has this much talent and definitely can absolutely find their way to Atlanta at the end of the year and maybe just shock the world and win this conference. So it'll be fascinating to watch that develop. Definitely a ton of things to watch in this conference overall. And I think when you look at the SEC this year, it frankly could be one of the craziest years in its entire history. Obviously, adding two teams like Texas and OU definitely helps that a little bit, but also I feel like there's just more parity around this conference than there has been in quite some time. It feels like obviously Georgia is the big dog on campus. They are the ones that everyone is kind of chased down as of right now, but they're not necessarily too far ahead of a lot of these other teams. Ole Miss has done an incredible work this offseason. Bama is not as far back as people want to believe as of right now. There are tons of really, really good teams in this conference, but Missouri's going to have plenty to say because Missouri has so much experience on that team, specifically at the quarterback positions, at the wide receiver positions, and they've been able to fill some of the voids that they had on the offensive line, at the back end of that defense, at the running back position. They did all of those flawlessly. So it'll be interesting to see if they can kind of continue that momentum that they started in 2023. But Missouri's absolutely a team that we should be watching. And overall, the SEC is just going to be a fascinating conference this upcoming year where I have no earthly idea who's going to win it, and I think there's probably 6 different teams that could pull it off this upcoming year, and Missouri's absolutely one of them. So it'll be fascinating to watch that develop, but that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for all of the content and updates you could possibly need. We just have incredible people doing really, really good work across every single sport you could possibly want. So whether you're a baseball fan or a soccer fan or a wrestling fan, we have you covered over here. So no worries about that. Come on over to GSMC and we'll get you covered with everything you need in the world of sports. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.
Let's go.